I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at Pentecostal pacifism during World War I with Dr. Jay Beaman. He's the former professor of sociology at Tabor College and George Fox University, author of Pentecostal Pacifism. He co-edited Pentecostal and Holiness Statements on War and Peace and co-edited Early Pentecostals on Nonviolence and Social Justice. In part one of our interview, we already discussed his personal background, so go back and check that out. So, Dr. Beaman, thanks for joining us again.
It's good to be here, Dennis.
All righty. So, in the first part, we already talked about Pentecostals during World War I. So we're going to get much more into depth in that. So can you summarize what you've uncovered through your research on Pentecostalism, pacifism, resistance, etc. during World War I?
First, I think I've found, and I think thoroughgoing conscientious objection in the Pentecostal movement in World War I. And this was evidenced in at least three ways. One is in their creedal statements, their belief statements about not going to war as soldiers and as being conscientious objectors by belief. And secondly, it's evidenced in the magazines and books by their evangelists. And thirdly, it's evidenced in their practice. And that's what I've been spending most of my time on recently. If you think of the evidence of conscientious objection, refusal to kill, as a practical evidence, I think it fits in what Pentecostals would call signs following. So it's a kind of physical evidence of the Spirit's indwelling. Their draft cards are overwhelming evidence of their belief and practice in World War I, a kind of sign that followed their belief, of their refusal to kill, to fight, to destroy, and their desire to love. Their evidence of getting into trouble, the persecution they experienced, the public cost they paid, and the private cost for the practice of something countercultural in conscientious objection to war. This is a kind of sign following. It's something they produced as a sign of their belief. It's a kind of living proof in history of what they believe. And it's a kind of evidence that also could be found when they were drafted into the military and the various kinds of outcomes of being drafted against their will. And so sometimes they were court-martialed. And that court-martial is actual evidence of what happened, of their belief and how that belief was experienced in society in practical ways. They were court-martialed when they were drafted against their will. Sometimes they served as non-combatants in what they tried to negotiate as non-violent ways in the military. And sometimes, mostly, they were just not drafted. Their draft boards either took their statements and life seriously, or like most of the other young men who were going to be drafted in World War I, they were excused for other reasons. But in many cases, their draft board took seriously their testimony and gave them an exemption of sorts. And so they didn't serve. This is a kind of evidence of their belief and what actually happened. And I find it consistent and overwhelming evidence. I've actually been challenged many times, and there's a reason I've spent so much of my life on this, is because even like my critics, I want to know. I'm just as interested in what actually happened as they are. And one view from Pentecostals is, yeah, our forebears kind of talked about not going to war, but when push came to shove, put them under persecution, and they caved big time. And it's because they didn't really mean it in the way you think. And what I've found is there's so much evidence of how they tried with their lives to say no. And I want that evidence out there.
So do you have any idea, like, what percentage that were drafted or attempted to be drafted were given exemption, as opposed to those that actually were put in prison for refusing?
Well, if I took my overall sample of 20,000 draft cards, about 10% of those are Holiness and Pentecostal people. In my whole sample, only about 10% can I find evidence that they probably did what most people think of as military service. So about 90% did not. And among the various groups, Mennonites, Quakers, Adventists, Church of Christ, Jehovah's Witnesses. Among these groups, Pentecostals stood up very well, similarly to other groups. And so about 90% of my sample probably didn't do normal military service. And given that thousands of people were being put in prison, in military detention, military segregation, being punished publicly, that's incredible evidence that against great odds, they were accepting the suffering along with all the others. I don't think they clearly saw what was ahead. I don't think the Mennonites did either, or the Quakers. The degree to which the government would bring pressure on them to conform and also to be quiet. Pentecostals got in trouble as much for speaking up as for not serving. Many preachers who were not the right age to be drafted got in trouble for saying the wrong things during the war. And so this is evidence of their conscientious objection, but it's also evidence of their getting in trouble for it and their failure. The society looked at them as failures, even criminals, spies, pro-German. So in the evidence that I look at, Pentecostals stand up very well with all the others. Now, in fact, most people who didn't go to war, most men who didn't go to war, were exempted because they had families to care for. And a lot of them just put right on their draft card, I can't go, I've got a family. A lot of them just filled out the family status part of their card in such a way that it was clear that we're not going to draft you. If we draft you, who's going to work and pay for the costs of your family? And if we draft you, who's going to take care of your household? You're more important doing what you're doing at home. And so many Pentecostals also got the family exemption. 2/3 of all exempted men were exempted because of family reasons. And Pentecostals got that as well. Many times somebody would say on their draft card, I'm a conscientious objector. But draft boards, in examining them, would be like, yeah, we don't even want to get into that issue. We don't even want to have a discussion about that. But, you know, you've got a wife and children. You're a farmer. You can be of more use here locally. Or maybe your occupation is such that you can be of more use locally. And like all other groups, some of them got exemption just as ministers. And some of them were expected, though, to divvy up and actually go to war. And they were drafted, usually the ones who were the youngest and who hadn't yet formed a nuclear family. They were more likely to be drafted. And ones who weren't farmers, or ones who weren't from specific occupations that were more likely to be exempted, like pastors. So they got a lot of the same exemptions as others, even if they asked for conscientious objection. And so really, you could say that the real conscientious objection in World War I was the person who would say, for conscience sake, I'm going to stay and take care of my family. That's what I think I should do. But in fact, Pentecostals and these other sectarians were asking for religious, conscientious objection to war. What made it unique in World War I was you had all these new upstart sects who were asking for the same thing that a couple groups, the Quakers and the Mennonites and the Brethren and Hutterites, had gotten either early on in the American experience or somewhat later in a kind of carve out where their whole group negotiated with first the King of England, in Pennsylvania as a colony, and later with the democratic governments. Can we have a carve out because we don't believe in killing? We don't believe in going to war, even for a good cause. And so these later sectarian groups that formed in the 1900s and early 20th century, they were asking for what Mennonites and Quakers and others thought was theirs. By right, we have the right to be exempt from war and still live in your society. And now, American new religious groups were forming. We call them sects. But they were forming and asking for that right that had historically been for kind of ethnic and cultural and religious minorities. And it became a problem. Somebody who needs to create a draft pool of 10 million men and actually draft 3 million of them into service, they didn't want this kind of story getting out that, all you have to do is say, I'm very religious. I'm a Christian. And so that became a problem. And Pentecostals give real evidence of saying no, and also going through all the experiences that all the others did when they did say no.
So of all these different groups you're referring to, besides conscientious objection, what would you say they have in common? And besides that, were there secular people, socialists, or other flavors of political persuasion who refused to fight?
So what I would say is you had lots of new religious sects in the 1900s. The Adventists, the
Jehovah's Witnesses?
Jehovah's Witnesses, the Holiness and Pentecostal, the Church of Christ, what we call the Stone Campbell movement. Quite a number of these groups were making the case that they were the true Protestant reformers. They were the children of the Protestant Reformation from hundreds of years before, and that in coming to America, they were fulfilling the dream of the Protestant reformers of fully realizing the Reformation. And so what we call the left wing of the Reformation, the Anabaptists, the believers' churches, they worked at becoming separate groups. Each of them kind of believed that they were the carriers of the Reformation message of reforming the church, making the church true, and as a result, transforming the world for Jesus Christ. And in the American experience, they had some things in common. They created a narrative of how what they were doing fulfilled the dream of the American colonies, of establishing this holy land in the wilderness. Sometimes what's now referred to as manifest destiny. Well, it was the Calvinists who first pushed that idea that by coming to America, they were going to completely reform the church and produce a society that was truly godly. And these new sectarian groups kind of picked up that ethos, and each of them tried to tell how their story was actually the story that was told in the Old Testament when the children of Israel entered the promised land. And it was the story that was the dream of the New Testament. And they were following Jesus. And in following Jesus, they were making America great, if you think about it. And there was something in that dream that sort of coalesced with what we think of as the dream of democracy and the narrative that was forming about America. And the Civil War gravely tested that narrative. But I think that coming out of the Civil War, there was a push for making it real, making it more true. And it fired a kind of view of history that was sort of apocalyptic. And it was really captured a little bit later by what we call premillennialism. And most of these groups had some view that was fairly similar to what we now call premillennialism. And it was a view that the second coming of Jesus was kind of going to be the crowning achievement of events that had happened in Europe and now in America. And that history was going to kind of culminate in the same story as we think of the biblical narrative. And I find in my sample among Mennonites, for example, a surprising use of Old Testament biblical names in America in World War I. Abraham's maybe the main name, you know. They believe themselves the carrier of this old story. And other Protestant sectarian groups were doing the same thing. And it was a convenient story that was being used by America. Uh, Now, a number of other groups were adopting this same narrative. The Masons, one of the main groups that people would join in every community. Um, Apparently, our first president was a Mason, and a number of other presidents were Masons. The myth or the ethos that developed around the Masons was a myth that we sometimes call British Israel. The belief that America had taken over the promises to ancient Israel. And this wasn't by accident. In fact, the English monarchy had already done that because the 10 lost tribes of Israel had migrated through Europe, through Germany, and finally to England. And the promises to Israel were on the monarchy in Israel, in England, and came to fruition in the democracy of America. Secular Masons believed that they were the children of Israel in modern America. And they even used this myth to explain working men, why common working men were the children of Israel. If you look on your dollar back in the day, it had a pyramid on it and an eye, Masonic symbols of the belief that American workers in capitalism are children of Israel. We built the pyramids. We're the salt of the earth kind of workers, you know? Take care of us. We have rights. And the Masons adopted this myth, which they probably knew was pretty much mostly myth. And you might say the more learned among them were kind of cynical in how they used the myth, but it worked. It was pretty useful. But the unintended consequence was that American religion in these sectarian groups pulled that myth right into their eschatology. And a myth we call British Israel came to be adopted in many of these new sectarian groups. Now, some of them have rooted out some elements of British Israel today. But the main group who adopted it, we call them Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints. And they believe that the United States, what is now the United States, the Americas, was the fulfillment of ancient Israel. And, you know, in one version of it, Jesus Christ came to the New World and preached to Native Americans way back. That this new world takes on the promises of ancient Israel. Well, as something called Zionism developed in the 19th century and then into the 20th century, with the Holocaust and with the return of people of Jewish lineage to the Holy Land, this myth became absorbed into many of these sectarian groups as the explanation for why people are going back to Israel. In the dark side of that myth, you have this view that Americans, Anglo-Saxons, British, not the slaves, not the Native Americans, they carry the promised seed. And it even becomes a kind of biological view of chosenness. And it works very well with the view of chosenness that was being promoted by many in America. as the explanation for why we made this nation that we made and what is special about it. And it even became the reason for our exceptionalism. And later, it becomes tied up with the fortunes of the nation state of Israel, not just the people of Israel, but a certain view on how Palestine is going to end up. Well, I'm actually arguing in what I'm finding that the group that in World War I believed themselves to be the carriers of the Protestant Reformation and making this country a godly nation and fulfilling the Old and New Testament. In the process, they found this British Israel myth kind of convenient. And so Pentecostals like Charles Fox Parham believed in British Israelism and promoted it. John Alexander Dowie, who I wrote my dissertation on, who founded Zion, Illinois, as a holiness, healing community, and died before Pentecostalism got off the ground, but really was a big part of the background for Pentecostalism, was considered a prophet by many early Pentecostals. John Alexander Dowie founded his city, which he called Zion. The city of Zion was laid out on a X pattern to be a Union Jack, a key symbol of British Israelism. Okay, so even in promoting their view of how the Christian faith was going to fulfill promises of the Old and New Testaments and the Protestant Reformation, they adopted Zionism as such. And a kind of Zionism that was associated with what the British were actually sending our way in a rather cynical way, British Israelism, even though most British knew that was just how you justify the monarchy. That becomes the seeds, I think, for the undoing of the peacemaking that was growing in these Protestant groups. So in the state of Israel, as the linchpin to their view of prophecy, in that they found a reason for godly violence. And we have an example in one of them, Frank Sanford, who founded Shiloh in Maine, which was a holiness community. And Zion and Shiloh were competing with each other. Dowie and Frank Sanford were competing with each other. And one element of their competition is their leaders were calling each of them Elijah, who would come before the second coming of Jesus Christ, who would help reestablish Zion or Jerusalem. And Frank Sanford in Shiloh, Maine, and John Alexander Dowie in Zion, Illinois, both were calling themselves Elijah, the forerunner of the second coming. And their followers, who would then later become Pentecostals, also believed this. They even got some major evangelical leaders and Quakers and Salvation Army people to follow them. And this actually became a point of contention when
I guess
the
so.
Booth Clibborns, who were Salvation Army people, but he was a former birthright Quaker. When they joined Zion, after being removed from the Salvation Army and preaching divine healing and emphasizing premillennial eschatology in the Salvation Army, they were removed from leadership, even though she was daughter of the founder, Katie Booth. And Booth Clibborn, her husband, who took her name, Booth, even though he was a Clibborn, he joined Dowie, but she would not join because Dowie was calling himself Elijah, forerunner of the second coming. And she was like, this is too much. I can't agree to this. And it almost hurt their marriage. It certainly gave them a struggle for a while. But many of their children became ardent Pentecostal leaders. And much of Zion actually came into Pentecostalism. Some of it right there in Zion and in Milwaukee, just north of Zion, Illinois. But much of the ethos of Zion came into Pentecostalism and the British Israelism of it. Now, later Pentecostals have tried to distance themselves from British Israelism, but the British Israelism really was the way they captured the American imagination, because so many Americans, right down to our first president, believed in British Israel and that America was the fulfillment of Israel and had taken over the promises to Israel. And then by adopting Zionism, that Israel would be reformed in Palestine, they were able to kind of even redeem the kind of darkness in this myth, the British Israel myth. America wouldn't be the only receiver of the promises of God for the Reformation. America wouldn't be the only ones to receive this. Israel would be saved too before the second coming or at the second coming. And so one of the people who was so formative in Pentecostalism, even though he never became a Pentecostal, a holiness evangelist, Frank Sanford, in World War I, Frank Sanford, who had been preaching pacifism for 20 years, conscientious objection to war. He came to tell his followers during World War I that they should join the war effort. And and what was the reason? It was because this war was going to be the war that we would ultimately call Armageddon. And they would be fighting on the side of Jesus to liberate Palestine. So really, as early as World War I, this British Israel kind of story was charting the course that Pentecostals would take. And I think it was a prophecy of how they would lose their belief in nonviolence when they could finally find a Christian view of the state that would save Israel, the nation state of Israel. And the fulfillment in Israel then would give them a state that they could fight for. Many of these other groups were also ardently British Israel. In many cases, they lost that quite early and just adopted Zionism of various forms. But these are things they had in common. Many have called communism, socialism, a Christian heresy. for becoming the secular version of what Christianity was trying to do in Europe and the United States in the Protestant Reformation, that ended up in these sectarian groups that said, we will remake society as godly society, and this is how it will look. Some suggest that Karl Marx was just taking a secular view of European history as capturing the future of history and the meaning of history and the reason for history found in the working man or the working person. And so these groups came into World War One. Most of them, I would say, made it through World War One with their peacemaking intact, with their conscientious objection intact. The socialists actually decided as a group in World War One to let their members, many of them who had claimed conscientious objection, let them actually go to war. And they actually took Woodrow Wilson's point of view. This is the war to end autocracy, monarchy. Parentheses, got to save the British monarchy while you're doing it. This is the war to end autocracy by ending German autocracy. Once we do that, yes, workers will get their rights. We'll make America more democratic, and we'll spread the wealth. And so I think the socialists who started the war saying, we won't fight our brother socialists in Germany. We won't fight the workers in other countries just in this war to save capitalism. In time, they came to say, yeah, we can fight the war, but after the war, we expect something in return. So these groups had an ethos, a belief system, and I think kind of central to it was this British Israelism, which was so associated with what we now call manifest destiny, and was easily turned towards the advantage of the very people they were trying to reform and resist. Once you gave this America this religious exceptionalism, because they were the chosen people, then it's very difficult to argue after that, okay, if this is who we are, won't you fight for us?
Wow. Okay, so yeah, that fills in a lot of the holes there for some important history there. Let's move on to how you did your research. So you collected these cards, not baseball cards like a lot of people do, but draft cards. So what does your research from these cards reveal, and what other evidence have you compiled relating to conscientious objection during World War I?
So in collecting draft cards, I was essentially trying to answer the question that Pentecostal scholars after me had said, okay, you've made your case that Pentecostals said they believed in conscientious objection as a core belief, but you haven't made the case that they actually did it. So I was looking around. Is there any evidence that they did do conscientious objection? And so I started gathering draft cards, and it's basically my life cycle follows the age of information. And at the point I needed to answer this question most, a new data source had become available in Ancestry.com. And so Ancestry was making it possible, and really, I say that Ancestry was motivated by the Mormon Church, who was collecting records on everybody. It's debatable why they were. why they were collecting historical records. But they were collecting historical records. Some say because they believed they could baptize people who were dead, kind of in proxy, and that they would receive the salvation of the later date saints by being baptized. Well, Mormons collected all these documents, and what we found was that everybody wanted to research their ancestry. And one of the things that they liked to do was to show that Uncle so-and-so or Grandpa were good patriots in World War I. They were heroes fighting in World War I. And I thought, okay, if you can prove that, maybe you can use the same documents to show that Uncle so-and-so or Grandpa so-and-so were conscientious objectors to World War I. And I was looking at draft cards, and there was a place you could ask for exemption. And so I started this long, arduous task of collecting records on Pentecostals. I started with lists of Pentecostals from their own archives and from their own stories they were telling about themselves. And I was able to find that many of the people who were at the right age in 1917 and 18, if they were between the age of 21 and 32, I thought they're going to have that draft card because all the men had to register. And so what I was finding was if I found a Pentecostal at that time with that age, they would have a draft card. And many of them put right on their draft card the reason they were choosing to be conscientious objectors and asking for exemption from military service. The reason was because they were Pentecostal. Some called it apostolic faith right on the draft card. Some said Pentecostal. Some said Assemblies of God. Some said Church of God. So all these groups were representing in their draft cards. And I was finding hundreds of them. Looking at lists. I finally got the Assemblies of God to give me documentation on the formation of their congregations around the country so that I could look at the names of the founders of each congregation and see if the names were men who were young men in 1917 and 18 who were the right age to have a draft card. And I found that of this group, a large number of them right on their draft card said conscientious objector or religious objector or Assemblies of God or apostolic faith or Pentecostal or holiness. So right there. Now, as I'm looking for all these draft cards, I have to look them up in a database in ancestry.com that's filled with other people. And when I'm looking for these people, I'm finding all kinds of other conscientious objectors. And I'm throwing their records away because they're not Pentecostal. They're not telling the story I'm trying to document. And all of a sudden it occurs to me, man, you're spending most of your life doing this. Maybe when you find a record from one of these other groups, you should document it too. That would give you a good context. It would give you a context of who were the people asking for conscientious objection. Were they mostly Mennonites? Were they mostly Quakers? Were they mostly socialists? Or were they, a lot of them Pentecostals? And remember that in 1917, the Pentecostal movement was only about 7 years old. It was a very, very small movement. And over time, I've been able to show that of the sample I collected, 20,000 people, over 10% of them were Pentecostals. Way out scoring, if you want to put it that way, their competition. This small little ragtag group was producing amazing evidence of conscientious objection. In time, I realized that there were other sources of evidence, sometimes for people who wouldn't be found in draft cards. And so I started looking, and these also were available on ancestry.com. One was newspapers, who would tell the story of locals who were conscientious objector, as a way of showing that the draft board was doing their job in reining in conscientious objection, and that conscientious objectors were being forced into the same system everybody else was, and were having to abide by the law. The newspapers were carrying stories by name, and in many cases by denomination. And so now I could document from newspapers as well. And I could corroborate newspapers with draft cards. And I could gather more records. And then Ancestry picked up another source of data called, it's now called Fold. It's a source of records that are folded into Ancestry, but they have many military records. But they also have what are called the FBI files. And these are files that were collected by military intelligence or local vigilante groups. And the records ultimately got folded into what came to be called the Bureau of Investigation, and then the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's just an ultimate irony that the ones who were collecting records on them so they could jail them, they could prosecute them and punish them for resisting the war, the widespread vigilante movement that was allowed by the government to put people in jail. Sometimes in jail for as little as saying, I'm not going to give money to the Red Cross. I want to give my money to my church, but I'm not going to give it to the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was given power to actually bring these people to court and put them in jail for sedition or espionage or resisting the war effort. And it got so bad that very quickly Pentecostals and Holiness people began to refer to the Red Cross as the Antichrist. And the reason they said it was the Antichrist was you couldn't buy or sell without the mark of the beast from Revelation. And what was the mark of the beast? Well, if you gave to the Red Cross, they would give you a lapel pin. And with that lapel pin, you could say, I gave to the Red Cross war effort. I'm supporting the war. And if you didn't have that, they could make it possible you couldn't shop in the local stores. Or if you were a local merchant, nobody would shop at your store unless you had the mark on you. And what was the mark? It was a red cross. It was the symbol of the Antichrist, the red cross of blood. You know, the cross that symbolizes shedding blood. And so Pentecostals would say, that's the mark of the beast. And if you don't have it, you can't buy or sell. And you can be put in prison. And so these forms of evidence that were collected against them by what is now called the FBI, they're available on Ancestry.com. I can read the records of those who are essentially spying on Pentecostals and all other conscientious objectors. And they name them by name, and they tell what their violation was. How that in a sermon they said something that made somebody angry. At the end of the war, Frank Bartleman would say in a Pentecostal magazine, Frank Bartleman, famous Holiness evangelist and chronicler of the Pentecostals, and himself an ardent conscientious objector, Frank Bartleman would say, Pentecostals failed the Lord during the war. Spies were in every meeting. So basically what he was saying was, and he said, you couldn't say anything during the war. And the reason is because every meeting we had was the location of people coming into the Pentecostal movement to spy on us and then to report to the government and to throw us in jail. And these are the records that I was collecting in the FBI records, and also expanding my reach of who were in the Pentecostal movement and who were being persecuted for the war.
Okay, so there's a lot of confirmation.
These kinds of records gave me a great set of evidence.
Okay, good. So let's move on to, so the early Anabaptists took an absolutist view, and yet early on there were people that within their ranks that wouldn't go all the way with that. And so what does your research show about the commitment? Did, even though their denominations are teaching this, and obviously some people were following through, what do you find? How faithful were people in the long run to following through on this pacifistic stance throughout the war?
So Mennonites, more than any other group, adopted an absolutist view. And their leaders actually would visit the camps and help them maintain their absolute view of refusal to put on a uniform, refusal to ever take any military commands. The first command being put on your uniform. And Mennonites and Quakers already had a history of saying that clothing makes a difference. The way we present ourselves to the world makes a difference. They'd already had a number of arguments about what kind of clothing you could have. So they had some history of saying we're different, and you can see our difference in how we dress. But they also would say that the uniform signified taking orders from another commander than Jesus Christ. And like the Salvation Army, they would say, we're in the Lord's army. We don't fight in carnal wars. And putting on a uniform, taking military orders, is a violation of your conscience. You can't do it. And so they were absolutists, and they thought that everyone should be an absolutist. And I think an argument could be made that for the purpose of consistency, the logic of their argument that Jesus doesn't want us to kill, that's why we can't be in the military, they had to be absolutists. But there was another party that wanted to push the absolutism, and that was the government. The government wanted to say, unless you are willing to go to jail for saying no to putting on the uniform, unless you are willing to say no to do anything for the government. Actually, the government made the argument that if you won't support the war with money through supporting the Red Cross, or through giving money to the YMCA, or to literally giving money to the war effort through buying war bonds, investing in the war, a kind of tax, but it was a voluntary tax. But again, many people would be thrown in jail for not supporting it. So really, the absolutists, mostly Mennonites, but a lot of others too, the absolutists agreed with the government that you had to be absolute if you were going to be a conscientious objector. It was consistent. It went to the heart of making the decision right at the point of saying, no, I won't put on the uniform. I won't follow orders. I won't march. I won't drill. I won't train. So the absolutist was consistent and easily identifiable. The government liked that because, first of all, there's going to be less absolutists. So less people are going to lose to service. And they're easier to identify. And also they're easier to criticize because all of us compromise in some way with the government, even if we pay taxes, even if we do jobs that are important for the society while the war is on. It's all a compromise in some respect to help our nation survive this war and win. So where are you going to stop? Where are you going to draw the line of compromise? And the government liked that they could put pressure on people so easily to compromise. And in the public sphere, the argument of compromise was wonderful because it was a catch-22. If you agree with the government that you have to compromise on some things, then their line would be, yeah, camel in the tent. You have to compromise on everything. So both the government and largely the historic peace churches, but not all the Quakers, were arguing for absolutism. And the government would say, if we torture you and you still hold up under torture, then you were sincere. So that's absolutism. It's like dunking a witch. If she survives, if she floats, she wasn't really a witch, just like she was telling you all the time. So absolutism is what was kind of settled on. But in truth, many people were choosing some kind of compromise. And in fact, most Mennonite leaders were generous with their draftees who were forced into non-combatant service and served as medics or supply people or quartermaster, where you handed out blankets and tents and other supplies, Obviously, compromisers were helping with the war effort, but even the Mennonite leaders were kind of generous with them. We understand you didn't agree to this. You weren't real soldiers. You were what in the Revolution we called being impressed by the British into service. Not real soldiers, forced soldiers. Anyway, so everybody kind of agreed that we'll have this absolutist front, but there'll be compromise behind the scenes. So absolutism functioned to make clear what we really believe, but we all knew that there would have to be some kind of way of making it work that wouldn't get everybody tortured to death. And some did die of the torture.
All right. So moving on then, why does this all matter? Everything you come up with in your research, this was, over 100 years ago. So what are the implications from your research, and what should the church do today about it? I mean, should Holiness and Pentecostal denominations go back to their roots and reclaim these doctrinal statements and practice what the early Pentecostals did? Or what are your thoughts?
I think if, for example, if the Pentecostal and Holiness groups took my research seriously and said, we're going to put a statement in our belief statement that encourages people to be conscientious objectors to military service, I think it probably wouldn't work because their whole ethos has changed. Their whole belief about a lot of things has changed. And conscientious objection used to signal we're different. We are looking for a different outcome in the future than the outcome promised by the government of America or any other nation. We believe that God's kingdom is different. God's rule is different. What God wants to do in the world is different than can be accomplished by military takeover or military might or even militarily sustaining the present world order. And if they just added on a statement, we don't want to do military service, we should be exempted. To me, it would be equivalent to saying, like Pentecostals used to do when I was growing up, this is the day in PE where you dance. And so you bring a note from your family and your pastor saying, Jay can't dance. I feel like all that accomplished is now I can't dance. It didn't really change how I looked at society. It just told me, no, you can't dance. And it told the society, he just stands on the sidelines. He's not a full participant. And if Pentecostals weren't willing to examine the degree to which they have become completely Americanized, that the dream of America as it grew up and with all the things it captured in that dream, including slavery and killing off of Native Americans. If that dream is somehow going to be captured in the dream that Jesus had, that the God of the Old Testament had, if that dream is somehow fulfilled in all of this, and you can't say no to that, well, then it would be like saying Jay can't dance. But true enough, I'm an old man now, and you ask my wife, Jay can't dance. But that's not the big difference that we want to make. That's not the big difference we want to make in people's deep understanding of the world and their relationship to the world. And so if no change like that is made, then it wouldn't help, So I'm asking Pentecostals to ask about what was their vision initially, what really was their dream, and in certain ways that dream was probably just the American dream. You need to figure out where that was. In other ways, maybe their dream wasn't the American dream. How can they get behind what it was that's so central to what they believe? And I think it includes love and practical expressions of love. But also it includes what is true. What is America? How does America fit into the world and into history? When we say we support Christian missions, what do we mean by that? What's the purpose? What's the point? Uh, that's so. If what I want to do is change American religion, something more than make them peacemakers. I want them to think about how what we call contemporary American religious experience, how some of that was one dream that we call the American dream and manifest destiny. And maybe there was another dream kind of going on at the same time. And I want Pentecostals to remember the question, to back up and say, what was the question we were trying to answer to begin with? What was the problem to begin with? You know, I want to suggest to them that maybe this is a chance to see that instead of taking a victory lap, maybe what they need to do is show some humility and think about their roots. And so that's also what I'm doing with my research. And I think we could end this with sort of that. I think my research should be humble. It should include the fact that Pentecostals leaders would like to reinvent their history. And so I'm here to kind of push them, to nudge them to say, you're not admitting it all. Warts and all. Warts and all includes the fact that some of the things we believed because they were convenient. The reason we adopted the Masonic view of history is because that made us all look good. Anglo-Saxons look good. Not because it was biblical. So when you realize that, you don't double down on it. You kind of back up and say, okay, what place did eschatology play? And is the story that Pentecostals tell themselves of Azusa Street, that in 1900, Pentecostals came to California and struck gold? They found the key to history. Is that maybe sort of a convenient story they tell themselves that really is a way of their saying manifest destiny? And maybe now they're grown up. Now they're mature. They've got tools. They've got education. In some sense, they've captured the imagination of the American people. Now maybe they can ask, were there other parts of that dream that we were kind of pushing that they really weren't the dream? And conscientious objection is a sign. It's not the goal. It's a sign of something real that was happening. I say it's one of the signs of the Spirit, to use Pentecostals' language. Have you been baptized in the Spirit? One of the signs. Here's one of the signs. And when the sign disappears, the goal isn't just to reproduce the sign. It's to ask what the sign was pointing to.
Right.
Can we find that again? And so my methodology it goes along with a book that I like, where an evangelical writer says, I want to write you a book called A Thicker Jesus. Talk about the actual Jesus who walked in the flesh. And so the way to look at a thicker Jesus is to put him into social and historical context. What was he saying in light of what was happening in his time? Who was Jesus, the human, the man? And I want to say to Pentecostals, you could have a thicker Pentecostal if you looked at their historical records. And one part of that record is they're saying, we won't kill in war, even for the state. But there are all kinds of other things they were saying as well. And you don't get to it by ignoring the historical documents. So what I've done is actually look at the historical documents, the draft records, the census records, the government FBI records, the newspaper records. Look at them again. Look at them more carefully and see if they don't tell you what these people were like. And that's really the use. And so I would also say to Pentecostals, all kinds of things you could learn from the larger society could come by learning more. And so don't be afraid of science. Don't be afraid of what science is teaching us. Don't be afraid of your kids getting educated and thinking clearly. And don't be afraid of participating in society in things that can improve society. Those things are trying to do some of the same things you're trying to do. So that's really what, to me, the outcome of this research is you can do good historical research. You can admit the history, warts and all, and sometimes you'll learn something in it that would make you ask other questions about your group. And
right.
Pentecostals, when people criticize you, when society criticizes you, it's not time to double down. It's time to listen to the criticism and ask,
humility is key.
Can we be better?
Okay, well, I think that's a good time to end there on some good encouragement, good information, good history. So this is really important stuff for us to consider. So I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Jay Beaman, considering Pentecostal pacifism during World War I and beyond. So Dr. Beaman, thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to talk with you, Dennis.
All right, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.